For those who are joining us, welcome to our affiliate webinar on how to gain clients' trust in managing their data. We're going to let everyone give them just a couple more minutes to come online. So if you just be patient, we'll be back with you in just a couple minutes. Okay, all right, well, I think we're going to get underway. Good morning and good afternoon. I'm Steve Bonoff, President of Printing Industry Midwest, and I want to welcome really members from all over our North American affiliate network. I know we have people on the call today who are registered all the way from Portland to Portland and all the numerous states in between. So this is an all affiliate event, and we'll make sure that all of you are going to be receiving a recording and the PowerPoint slides of our program today over the next 24 hours. Just a couple housekeeping areas. So on a webinar versus a meeting, you do have the opportunity to use the Q&A feature. This is the best way for you to ask your questions to make sure that they're presented either live or we can answer them in a written manner, and then that Q&A is archived for everyone to see. If you want to use the chat, just chat in a technical question or a question to staff. Otherwise, we encourage you to use the Q&A function. You can, as you know, you're all Zoom extraordinaires now, but you can hit the view button on the top. We suggest you do the speaker view to make sure that you're getting the right experience of seeing the person who's actually speaking on today's webinar. And you can also resize that, making it larger or smaller. So let's move on to today's webinar. You know, managing data is both a critical client service today, but it's also an area of risk for print service providers. You know, as more clients are becoming data savvy and targeted in their communications, they're seeking increased confidence in how their data is secured. So building trust can become a challenging and critical task. So today's webinar is just one way that we're addressing the issues of data privacy and management. At PIM, and I know other affiliates are going to be able to take advantage of it as well, we're developing an online portal to address these issues with best practices, access to experts and resources to ensure that companies are having the information necessary to comply with the ever-evolving government regulations and data management best practices. Two people that are supporting our data initiatives are here with us today. And they're both from CLA, which is an advisory company, also known as CliftonLarsonAllen. They have deep ties to our industry and do understand the needs of print service providers. So that's why we've engaged them to support this effort today and ongoing. So our speakers today, we have Kadian Douglas. She's been with CLA for over 13 years. She works in the specialized advisory services team. She performs consulting and advisory services, including information security reviews and risk assessments to evaluate current security programs against industry standards and maturity models. Phillip Bello is also with CLA. He's been with them for over 11 years and works on that same team with Kadian. He's helped clients work through SOC standard changes and has an in-depth understanding of SOC 1 and SOC 2 reporting requirements. And he also leads the HITRUST practice at CLA and helps clients with HITRUST validated assessment engagements and HITRUST readiness assessments. So they're really have a wealth of knowledge in this arena. So I think we're going to be very pleased today to get a better understanding of really this critical issue. So I want to welcome you both to our webinar today, Kadian and Phillip, and I'm going to turn it over to you to take it away.
Thank you very much, and hello everyone. Thanks for having us today, and we look forward to an engaging presentation. Please feel free to submit any questions that you may have to us, and we will make sure that we answer them either throughout the presentation or at the end. Just wanted to provide some information that the information here today is more general in nature, right? And should not be construed as legal advice for you. And then just a quick background about CLA. If you're not sure who CLA is, we are a professional services firm, and we have more than 120 locations across the United States with over 700 to 400 individuals and family members that works here. And we have about 900 principals that works at CLA. And we are a very old family here, that over 60 years and counting that we have. We have 14 focus industries that we focus on, and amongst other emerging industries as well. And for our clients, we try to provide a seamless integrated services to our clients. So from assurance work to tax to wealth advisory to various consulting work, we are able to provide those for our clients. So we try to make it a seamless experience. And once you choose CLA for one service, you choose all of CLA. With that said, I wanted to just show this a quick map as to what we look like within the United States. You could see that we have quite a good coverage across the United States with those 120 locations. In addition, we also have a member affiliate with Nexia from an international perspective. So if we have clients or services that we have to provide in other countries, we are able to do that as well. So that's just a quick background as to who CLA is. And I will turn it over to Phil to continue for our agenda and to kick it off. Phil?
Thank you, Kadian, and Steve, thanks for the introduction. Appreciate that. We are very excited to be here presenting to you all today. Definitely want this to be interactive, like Kadian mentioned. Submit any questions through the Q&A. We'll try and answer as many as we can here. And then if we can't get to all of them, we'll definitely follow up with you and provide some direct feedback on those questions. So with that, we'll just get into the agenda here. So as the title of the presentation mentions, and as Steve was discussing as well, sharing data is not something to be taken lightly. Data is a lot of organizations' most important asset when it comes down to it. That's the basis of their business and the driver for a lot of their revenue. So with that, and with sharing data comes a lot of risk. We'll talk about some of the risks to obtaining data from either clients, customers of yours, and other third parties. We'll also talk about how to mitigate that risk and gain that trust of those third parties and of your customers so that you can have successful and long-lasting business relationships. We'll also go through a couple of different independent assessment options. I'm sure all of you read within the description that we're going to be covering SOC 2 and HITRUST specifically. There's a lot of different assessment options out there when it comes to security and privacy, but those will be two that we'll dive into in a lot more detail. And then additionally, Kadian will take you through some of the various data privacy and compliance requirements with that long list of acronyms that are out there now with every state and regulatory requirements that are coming out. It seems like almost once a month a new privacy requirement is coming out. So she'll kind of walk you through some of that and some of the latest updates as well as best practices. So we all know there's risk with sharing data. We see it in the headlines with the different breaches that come out on a daily basis. We feel the weight of that risk when we're contracting with a new customer. And so just wanted to kind of touch on some of the key points of what those risks are. It's not meant to be a comprehensive slide, but really just to get us started with some of the discussion here. And when we think of the risk of sharing data, obviously there's operational, but the biggest point of that risk comes down to what would happen if there was a breach of the data that you had that was shared by a customer third party, or if there's a security incident for involving that data. So we'll look at it kind of from that standpoint as we go through the presentation today. On the compliance front, there's definitely a growing list, like I mentioned, of privacy requirements, regulatory requirements. Each state is coming out with their own federal requirements, and just depending on the different industries that you're in, there can be industry requirements as well. One of the most common that we see mentioned and involved a lot is related to HIPAA or PHI data. I'm sure all of you know that the HHS has a requirement for a report of a security breach that involved PHI of more than 500 individuals must be communicated to Health and Human Services. And even the business associates that are kind of the downstream entities of that covered entity can be held liable for those breaches. And yeah, with that, they have a website out there. It's called sometimes the Wall of Shame, but more like the website of shame that lists out all those entities that had that breach, how many individuals were affected, and what the details were of it. So you want to try and do your best to stay off that website of shame, and hopefully going through some of these slides and presentation today will give you some best practices for that. Financial risk, obviously critical. The IBM report recently that just came out says that within 2020, the average cost of a breach for organizations in the United States was actually $8.6 million. The United States, out of all the countries, has the highest average cost of a data breach for whatever reason. But it was just interesting to see within that report, and we included a link there if you wanted to read through it further. And then within the US, each industry they report on and what the costs are. The healthcare industry, not surprisingly, has the highest average cost of data breach or breaches involving healthcare data, followed by financial institutions and then energy industry and energy related data. And those costs are kind of the total costs related to a breach, not just if they were to steal financial money from you, but the cost for forensics, paying a company to come in and assess what happened, trying to determine if the cause was mitigated, being sued by anybody whose data was involved in the breach, and paying for credit monitoring or fraud protection for those individuals for a certain period of time after the breach occurs. And I have, I think, several different companies that are paying for credit monitoring and fraud protection right now just due to breaches. I'm sure you all receive those emails and get offered that free. So I think I'm covered for the next 15 or 20 years, which is not, I guess, a good thing, but good to have. Reputational risk, obviously very critical here, and involves, after a breach were to occur, what would need to be done to kind of change that, the view of your organization from a marketing effort to rebuild the reputation, rebuild that customer trust. And also within reputational risk, you have to consider not just the organizations you're getting data from, but the third parties that you're using to possibly access that data or support your organization as well. It was reported, I think recently, 59% of breaches that were reported were caused by one of their third parties, not the organization itself that was the primary owner, custodian of the data. And within each of these risk areas, I included the bullet point just to kind of emphasize that the main risk here is the ability to continue doing business. It's very unfortunate that after a breach occurs of data, that a lot of organizations don't survive that. One example recently, in 2019, Quest Diagnostics had a breach that involved 12 million patients. It wasn't something within their own network of systems that caused the breach, but with their billing collections vendor, American Medical Collection Agency, AMCA, they were the ones who had the breach occur, and Quest was able to recover and still in business. But I think the breach was reported in May of 2019, and in June of 2019, AMCA filed for bankruptcy. So it's a real risk when you think about it from a risk assessment perspective. The impact and likelihood, the ability to continue doing business is kind of the biggest impact when you think about risk of sharing data, and the likelihood of that happening if a breach were to occur is actually pretty high when you look at the number of organizations that don't survive a breach. Maybe not necessarily the likelihood of a breach occurring, that's a different kind of risk profile, but the ability to continue doing business. So with that, lots of risk in sharing data. How do we build that trust or gain that trust and have our clients and customers be confident that we're securing the data that they're providing? This all starts with what you're doing internally, having security practices and a security culture within your organization that is well-defined and pervasive throughout your organization, not just the job of an IT individual, but the job of everybody. Having a security risk management program involves defining policies, procedures, and making sure all of those are implemented and followed by everyone in the organization. Data classification, inventory. This is a crucial step in understanding what you have, the different types of data that you have, where it's stored, how it's transmitted, who has access to it. Best practice is just kind of using that least privilege model. So designating specific locations as to where certain types of data can be stored, securing it when it's transmitted, defining kind of the encryption for transmitting data and making sure that you're using that encryption every time, and then restricting the access. If you don't need to use the information, you shouldn't have access to it. Incident response plan is kind of another key that just wanted to point out here. It's something that a lot of organizations struggle with, defining that incident response plan and then training through security awareness training and other exercises of testing it. But it's something that can be very helpful. I think there was a study done that on average, if you have an effective incident response plan that's tested and proven and understood by everybody, you can save on average a little over $1 million per breach if you have a breach. Security awareness training is critical for that culture piece, making sure that everyone's taking the training and aware that their responsibility is security, no matter what their job title says. And when you think about security awareness training, I like to think about, what's an effective way to do this and how do I learn best? Having a webinar that I'm multitasking and clicking through and not really paying attention to isn't how I learn or the best way that I learn. So think about that when you're thinking about security awareness training and what you can do to make that effective and make sure that everyone is really taking that to heart. And then obviously test everything that we just talked about above, especially with security awareness training. That a good way to make that more interactive and have people apply the training is to do a test like an email phishing test to make sure that everyone's able to identify and report those phishing emails that come through, since that's huge risk these days. All right, so independent assessments. These can be very important to gaining trust or having that third party come in and provide you with the certification or report of some kind. But also think about these from if you do have a need to improve your security program overall, bring in some expert or consultant that can help you with it. If you don't think you have the resources internally to really build that out. It's not just, independent assessments aren't just for that report to hand over to a customer. It can be used to help you develop your own program and make improvements and keep it up to date. I included a couple different bullets here for some different independent assessments or compliance required reports, but the list goes on pretty extensively. Strong reputation. So staying out of the headlines, also staying in the headlines for the right reasons can help with the reputation. Make sure you're over communicating with your customers, with your third parties about your security practices and what you're doing to strengthen that internally. You have a blog post or share a press release if you do obtain a certification of some kind, or have an independent assessment performed that really shows what you're doing to take security seriously. And then the questionnaires, we all have to do these. We have to do them at CLA when we onboard clients sometimes, and I'm sure everyone's had them kind of come through and working with customers, or maybe on an annual basis as part of due diligence. These are important to gaining that trust because it allows you to answer and kind of directly address some of the concerns that your customers or clients may have. But having an independent assessment can sometimes help you bypass these, or at least provide you with the information, kind of a central report or area to make that process more efficient and use less resources and consume less time to get through those questions. All right, and skip back. I think this is where we, Steve wanted to post that first polling question. I'm hoping everyone can see it. I just had it pop up here.
So we have just launched our first poll of, have you had an independent assessment completed in the past 2 years? I've got another about 15 seconds or so giving you to complete that, and then we'll end it and share the results. Still have people. All right. Give 5 more seconds. And there we go.
Can I just drag the results on, or hopefully everyone can see that?
The results should be available.
So we had 68% answer yes, 32% no. So for those of you that answered yes, great job. And hopefully as we go through these, there's some information that you can pick up, or maybe learn more about the assessments you're being performed. And for those of you that answered no, feel free to ask questions as we're going through this, or any areas that you want us to dive more in depth. So we'll start with the SOC 2. Like I mentioned, we'll cover SOC 2 and HITRUST here, and compare them, kind of break them down a little bit, and see what the differences are, the benefits of both. So SOC 2 is a reporting framework under the AICPA. It's currently under the Statement and Standards for Attestation Engagements, number 18. It used to be under SSA 16. Before that, SAS 70. So it's been kind of an evolving report over the years. And I think the next year or two, it'll be SSA 21 or 22. So we just refer to it as SOC 2 because that acronym and name of the report hasn't changed. So the report itself is not a certification. There's no SOC 2 certification. It's a common misconception. It's more of a audit report similar to a financial audit report. It has an auditor opinion, and which is very similar to a financial audit opinion. The opinion in a SOC 2 covers the controls at the organization, and if those controls are implemented and operating effectively over a period of time. So it covers a historical period. It does not provide a guarantee. You're not certified for SOC 2 for a year. There's no future guarantee of the report. It's a historical view, and just, I guess, referred to as an examination or audit, not a certification. Just wanted to emphasize that. The scope is, so to understand the scope of a SOC 2, it's kind of important to understand the report itself and how the different sections of the report break down. So the first 2 sections would be just the auditor's opinion and management's assertion, which is basically management's opinion. The third section of the report would be the description of the system that's included in the scope of the report. That description is based on the AICPA description criteria. So they define what needs to be included in there, and it covers things like significant changes to the controls or to the security. You actually have to report if there were any significant security incidents during that period, the components of the system, as well as the details of the scope. Section 4 of the report is where you get into the trust service criteria, and that's really the basis for the SOC 2 is this trust service criteria. Trust service criteria is a control framework developed by the AICPA as well. and it's broken down into 5 different criteria: security, availability, confidentiality, processing, integrity, and privacy. Within a SOC 2, the security, or called the common criteria, is really the only required one. So the other 4 are actually optional, depending on what type of service you're providing and what your customers would be concerned with. There's 2 different types of a SOC 2. Type 1 is point in time. So that just looks at your controls and security practices as of one day, basically, and doesn't test the effectiveness over a period, which is where that type 2 report comes in. Type 2 is the more common kind of ongoing report to get done, and the one that's really more value to your customers going forward. SOC 2 Plus is also something just wanted to bring up. With this required trust service criteria that has to be included in the scope, you can also add other frameworks to a SOC 2. So the opinion can cover the trust service criteria, as well as, for example, the Hipaa security rule, which is a good option if there are other compliance requirements that you want to demonstrate for your customers or for any regulators or things like that. So who is SOC 2 for? SOC 2 is for a service organization. So any organization that accesses, processes, maintains data on behalf of another organization. SOC 2 used to stand for, so we still use the term SOC 2 all the time, and since it was started in 2011, but it used to actually stand for Service Organization Controls Reports. And then a couple of years ago, they changed it to System and Organization Control Reports, and just kind of changed the words that make up the acronym, but kept the acronym. And they did that because they came out with a couple other SOC reports, one being for SOC for supply chain. So if you're selling a product, not providing a service, and you still need to demonstrate your security practices, there's other options out there now as well. So it's really for those service organizations. If you think of any function of the business that's being outsourced and sharing and processing data for, that is what the SOC 2 would apply. It's designed to fit really all industries and all size organizations. It's not an industry-specific type report, and it's designed to meet a broad range of customers and needs of those customers. So the report itself and the process for the SOC 2, it's typically performed every year. Again, similar to financial audit, but done kind of on an annual basis. So you can continue to provide that assurance to your customers that you are maintaining those security controls. The audit opinion is the result of it. So even with issues or exceptions or testing exceptions, if the controls weren't effective, you still would get an opinion that would be unqualified if it was clean, qualified or adverse if there were significant issues in there. And then the opinion is provided on that presentation of the description, the design of those controls, and the effectiveness of the controls that were tested over that period of time. All right, so let's dive into HITRUST next real here. So HITRUST, kind of a completely different animal here. HITRUST is HITRUST is an actual certification that's issued by HITRUST. The HITRUST organization was founded in 2007, and it's made up of the HITRUST Alliance, which is the kind of the nonprofit division that develops the framework and keeps on top of the framework, and then the HITRUST Services Corp, which is that comes out with this the tool HITRUST MyCSF tool that's used as you go through the certification process. HITRUST was not anything that was created from scratch. It was kind of a combination of a bunch of different security and privacy frameworks that really had the goal to come out with a consistent, comprehensive framework that can be used. And originally it was used for and focused on healthcare organizations. Healthcare had kind of their healthcare industry was lacking a little bit with security and staying on top of that compared to financial institutions or some of the other regulated industries. So HITRUST was designed to help kind of address that need. The scope of a HITRUST assessment is based on different factors. So when you start a HITRUST assessment, you would go through kind of a set of questions and covering the size of your organization, the number of transactions you process, records that you held, a couple different technical questions if you're hosted in the cloud or all on-prem. And then it allows you to select regulatory factors as well. So if you did want to demonstrate your compliance with HIPAA or CMMC or any of the other frameworks that are out there. It includes, I guess they're at over 40 now, security privacy regulations, and every update they do, I think they added 3 or 4 more just with the last update, so it's continuing to evolve. The requirements for HITRUST are broken down into 19 different domains, and those domains span kind of every aspect of security. Within the domains are what they call requirement statements, and those are specific kind of controls or settings, things like that, that you need to have in place to meet their framework and their requirements. When you go through the scope and go through an assessment, each of those requirement statements is assessed at their 5 maturity levels. So for each one of those, we would be looking at your policy to support that, your process or your procedures to support it, whether it's implemented and whether you've got a measured or managed function over that requirement statement. The one thing just to mention with that is the certification itself can be achieved with just the first 3 without having measure or managed in place. If you do score high enough on the first 3, then you don't need to demonstrate any measured or managed. The way the scoring works is it's based on averages on how you score for the requirement statements that are included. So it's a little bit different than a SOC opinion from that standpoint. So HITRUST was designed for organizations that deal with electronic PHI, and that's where we still see it mostly. Organizations contracting with large insurance providers and health plans. I think Healthcare Weekly put out that more than 90 payers and other healthcare industry companies require HITRUST to do business with them for their business associates. So that's really where HITRUST is, where we're seeing HITRUST assessments be required and when they would really be needed. It is now more of a broad certification. They adapted it so HIPAA is not a built-in requirement anymore, it's an option. And so they're trying to open it up to all industries to become the certification that all industries can have around their security. So the result of a HITRUST assessment obviously is the certification, or that's the goal of the assessment. The certification itself is good for 2 years, and during that in-between year, you're required to go through what's called the Interim Assessment. But the certification itself is good for 2 years before you have to do the full assessment again. It's also good for, like I was saying, HIPAA not being a required element anymore. So you can add that in if you need to demonstrate HIPAA compliance or CMMC, FISMA, Gdpr, CCPA. There's a ton of different options if you need to demonstrate compliance with another regulatory framework or industry framework.
Phil, this is a good time maybe to bring in a question that we have.
Sure.
Regarding what is the recommended risk framework certification program for global companies?
Sure. So for global companies, there is a SOC 2 that is not just the AICPA SOC 2, but there's an international standard that is pretty much the exact same thing. I think there's maybe a few words that are different in the report itself, but that is one type of framework that can be used and that would be recognized internationally as well. HITRUST, I don't know if I haven't seen many international organizations using HITRUST yet. but I can get you the name of the standard after the presentation for the international version of the SOC 2. It's ISAE, and I forget the numbers that go after it, but that would be a good one, I would think, as well as ISO 27001 is kind of an international standard. The ISO has a number of different certifications that they issue around all different types of processes, and the ISO 27001 covers the security management program as well. So that would be another good one. All right, so I wanted to do a couple slides just going side by side for these and highlight a few things just to point out as we look at them side by side. So SOC 2 Type 2 has trust service criteria. HITRUST has, based on MyCSF, that's the tool itself, and the HITRUST CSF is the framework. The SOC 2 trust service criteria follows the COSO model from a risk perspective. The MyCSF and the HITRUST CSF follows more of those 19 domains. SOC 2 is definitely less prescriptive. It allows for more flexibility for the organization within the common criteria, the only required criteria. There's actually only 33 elements of the criteria compared to if you're scoping a HITRUST assessment. I think at a minimum, I see around 250 requirements to be included. And that's a little bit kind of different to compare these two numbers. When you look at the criteria requirements, you'd have to map and align your controls with those criteria. So the number of controls is more like between 70 and 100, depending on the scope and the number of criteria included as well. So a little bit less prescriptive, a little bit more flexible. This is very specific and detailed. One's also certification, one is an audit report. So also big difference there on the scope. Timing. So a SOC 2 readiness assessment involves looking at what policies you have, procedures you have, what controls you have, and defining those specific controls to meet the criteria, as well as developing that system description that I mentioned earlier, and pointing out any gaps with that trust service criteria framework. Typically 2 to 3 months. These timelines all can vary significantly depending on the organization, but wanted to kind of point out and just show 2 to 3 months compared to 3 to 4 months for HITRUST readiness, because the HITRUST readiness, you don't have to define or develop a system description or write up and draft controls and map it. It's a lot more prescriptive. So it's taking the specific policy requirements. So they'll tell you exactly what you need to have in your policy, in your procedure, and for your settings, configuration, and controls. And so we'll go through all of that for all 250 and make sure that all of those are included in there so that you can score 100% kind of across the board for all the requirements, statements that are included in the scope. So that's kind of the difference there. I just wanted to show basically how the HITRUST does take a little bit longer. The SOC 2 Type 2, that's that ongoing report. The audit period for that covers usually at a minimum 6 months, up to a year. And after that, a report can be issued 1 to 2 months after the audit period, assuming all the documentation and testing and things like that are all occurring on schedule. And the full audit for the SOC 2 Type 2 occurs every year. HITRUST validated assessment, that's the one that gets you the certification. Actually, when you go through it the first time, HITRUST only requires that you have your controls and policies and procedures in place for the last 90 days. So it doesn't have to cover a full year. The interim assessment, that is kind of that in-between year, covers kind of from the time of your certification to the start of the interim assessment. And then after you go through and have your external assessor perform your HITRUST assessment, all the information submitted to HITRUST, and HITRUST does a QA over it in order to issue the certification. And that can take 2 to 4 months and involves kind of a draft report and writing up any corrective action plans for if there were requirement statements that didn't score 100% and things like that. Okay, so costs, everyone's favorite topic here. And big thing that comes up is, what's the difference in cost between the two? I didn't put actual numbers on the slides, and we definitely talked through them, but there's just such a variability in the cost between organizations, the size, the scope, the external party that you're having do the assessment. So didn't put it in there, but we can definitely talk through it. A readiness assessment for a SOC 2 compared to HITRUST, obviously shorter time, it means shorter or less costs, less hours involved from the external assessor. And readiness assessments span the gamut from like $10,000 if you have everything in place and ready to go, up to $30,000, and HITRUST can even be up to $50,000 or $60,000, depending on how much help you need. SOC 2 Type 1 is kind of that stepping stone as of one day report, and is really not meant to be that ongoing assessment, but the SOC 2 Type 1 costs, if you wanted to get that done as well, is in the around $20,000 to $30,000 range, can be higher or lower though. The SOC 2 Type 2 on an ongoing basis, depending on if you're just including security, small organization, and one system or one application in scope, can be between that 25 to 35 range, or up to if you're including all five, you're a huge company and a lot included in there, up to $50,000, $100,000. Really spans a big range there as well, depending on the scope. HITRUST validated assessment. This is driven a lot based on the number of those requirement statements. So before even scoping anything out with a customer, we would go through the tool and see how many requirement statements would be included in the scope. Validated assessments for the certification can range from 40, 50,000 for smaller ones up to well over 100,000 for some of the larger ones. Interim assessments are, since they include only one requirement statement to be tested from each of the 19 domains, can be pretty consistent, and just depends on the number of corrective action plans that we would have to assess at the interim assessment to kind of see what progress has been made. So those are usually around $20,000, $30,000. With HITRUST though also comes a HITRUST subscription. That's an annual fee, and you can definitely reach out to HITRUST if you're curious as to what those cost. They have different subscription models as well, and different price points. With each report that HITRUST issues, there's also a separate report fee that you should talk to HITRUST about as well if you're interested in the subscription and going that route. All right, I went through that pretty quick. Wanted to cover a lot, but hopefully you're able to absorb it. I know I mentioned SOC 2 Plus, and you may be thinking, so can we just add the HITRUST framework to the SOC 2 and cover all of it in one report? And the answer is yes. It's definitely an option, and would include a audit opinion and a report covering the trust service criteria and the HITRUST CSF criteria that's scoped to your organization. So it's a great option, and I found this quote on HITRUST website even that says it becomes default method of reporting to meet the widest range of requests, which I thought was interesting for HITRUST to put on their website. But they work well, for these types of assessments. HITRUST is definitely a supporter of them, and understand that it is a great option for a lot of organizations. So the big question on which independent assessment to choose. Industry obviously is a driver, as we talked about. Strategic goals, if you want to get into new industries, make sure you're considering that before you go and dive in and start taking on a bunch of PHI. That's a huge driver for it. Organization size and budget, obviously the costs are different, so if you have a specific budget in mind, that might impact your decision. And then contractual requirements with your customers. You may have 5 different customers that all have 5 different independent assessment reports that they are asking for, which can definitely be frustrating. A lot of times you don't need to have all 5 done, and if you're working up front with your customer, you can let them know, you have this one done and see if it's acceptable. A lot of times they're willing to take that in lieu of what their requirement is in the contract, especially if you are upfront about it and talk to them about it before going into contracting and before you sign anything. Wanted to point out just one thing real quick here. The High-Tech Act new update on January 5th. This is basically an update that allows the HHS to consider if you do have a recognized security best practice or some type of independent assessment that shows that you have security practices in place and have had them in place over the last 12 months. They will take that into consideration, and if you do have a breach and require any penalties, they may actually reduce those because you're showing that you take security seriously and have had security practices in place that may have been just some inevitable type of security breach there. Katie and I took longer than I said I was going to, so I apologize, but I will turn it back over to you.
No worries at all. That was good stuff. I enjoyed it, and I'm glad that we were able to get through that. So I wanted to put up a poll question here for the attendees to see from a privacy perspective. Steve, if you could help me with that, how many states have privacy requirements signed into law today that you could think about? So based on what Phil just talked about, he covered some of the assurance assessments we could perform, some of the certification assessments. Now we want to talk a little bit about consumer data privacy. So maybe 10 more seconds and then we could close out to see what you're thinking. All right, Steve, should we see what the results are there? So we have 4, 6, and 8. I think number 2 did not get any love today, but that's all right. The answer is actually 4, actually. So I will go ahead and share this map here. As you can see, this map shows how many privacy laws have been signed, those that are still in discussion, those that have been introduced. And as you can see, the 4 on the map there and the 4 states that actually signed already. The blue ones you can see are still in committee, and those orange ones are still being discussed or being introduced. And for the gray one, as you can see, those bills, they died or they've been postponed. So there continue to be discussion around data privacy. All right, so what are some of the current privacy regulations that we're seeing? So if we go back from a privacy perspective, Phil talked about some of the certifications that we could have. He mentioned a little bit about Hipaa, and you can see on here, there was an overall privacy that was determined based on who you're serving, what you're doing. The Privacy Act back in the 70s that was passed. From an educational perspective, you see FERPA, from protecting consumer information and customer information from a financial institution perspective. You see GLBA. You see how can we protect children online, and then of course from a healthcare perspective. So there are various ones that were put in place. But then, in the last 10 years or so, there've been more discussions around, consumer privacy regulation. And so you have heard quite a bit about the Gdpr, and that was one that's been out and signed since 2018. And then at home here in the California Consumer Privacy Act, and there are quite a few emerging US international regulations as you saw on that map. So let's talk briefly about GDPR. So as I mentioned, the discussion's been happening for a while, right? Back in 2014, you see that it was voted in, and then in 2016, they adopted it, but it was not enforced until May 2018, and that's when we at CLA here started doing some assessments for some of our clients from a gap assessment perspective to see how compliant they are with that. And we mentioned earlier from a certification perspective, but then we were just doing an assessment, a gap assessment. So we provided this chart for you so you could check to see whether GDPR would apply to you. And so GDPR is applicable if you're doing business or providing services or serving customers within the EU, right? Or then I always, an individual ask, you know, so what if someone from the EU is working here within the United States? It would be if you're doing business overseas over there, then that is that's when it would be applicable from operating within the EU. So this is a good chart here that you can use to check as you go through to see if GDPR is applicable to you. Some of the key provisions within GDPR, as you can see here, is the right to be informed and the right to have access to their data. And so your customers may reach out to say, you know, I would like the access to the data that you have for me, or what are you doing with the data? If they see some information that's incorrect, they can definitely reach out and say they would like it to be corrected from the rectification perspective. They could even ask to be forgotten. They could say, you know what, you have this information about me, I would like you to delete it, remove it, right? There's also some restrictions on that right for the initial purpose, but then they can request that information. Additionally, they can restrict the type of processing that you have and how you share the information with them that they requested, whether it's in print form, whether it's electronic via email as well. That last point I wanted to point out about the decision making and profiling. So there's some restriction about how you can profile someone based on the data that you have for them or what they look like. That is also restricted. Data breaches, I know that Phil mentioned that briefly, but wanted to point out that if there's any breach under GDPR from a loss or alteration of the data, it's been there's destruction of the data, etc., you would need to notify the customers within about 72 hours of the breach and include as much information as possible in a timely manner so that they are aware of that breach under GDPR. From a penalty perspective, we said, okay, well, you want us to go ahead and be compliant with this law that was passed. You know, most of the time we find that clients or prospects do not follow certain guidance unless there is some form of teeth to it, right? So the EU definitely went ahead and put that in theirs and their requirement to say it's going to be about 4% of your annual revenue if you're not securing and following the law under GDPR, or up to 20 million EU, as you can see there, or 23 million US dollars. And it relates to more from a consent perspective and privacy of design. So you can say, okay, we're protecting the data, but you have to prove that you have the infrastructure in place to protect the data as well. And then from a consent perspective, if someone asks, you know, some way in which they're able to reach out to request that as well. And there are also other violations that are based on a tier basis, as you can see here. So if we come back home, I wanted to give just a quick background as to one of that major privacy law that was passed. The California Consumer Privacy Act then was passed here in the United States, and then additional discussion around the California Privacy Rights Act that is being discussed. So what is that? You can see here the right to know, the right to deletion, the right to opt out. A good amount of these are still the same within GDPR, but I put this here so that you could refer back to it to see that there are quite a few of the consistent requirement as noted within GDPR. And as you can see here, some required notices as well is also noted from a CCPA perspective. A quick comparison here for us. So as you can see, the California Consumer Privacy Act, there was signed into law in June 2018. That was right when GDPR became effective and was enforced, was in May 2018. It took effect in January of 2020, however, and we found that we started doing some assessment last year for some of our clients. And then it was enforced back in July at that time. The follow-up then had to say, in California, they said they wanted to just, tighten the requirements a little bit more and provide some more oversight. And so that's when the California Privacy Rights Act was put in place. And that was approved by California voters back in November of 2020. And it's going to take effect in January 2023. And at this point, there's still discussions around it. It's not in effect yet. So our encouragement is for our clients and customers to go ahead and get an understanding of what it is and start putting into place the requirements. From a scope perspective, you said, what is really different when it comes on to CCPA and CPRA then? You see the dollar threshold is pretty much the same, right? And if you are buy or sell or receive or share business from commercial purposes or up to 50,000 plus consumers or household or devices, then CCPA would be applicable to you. You'll see then they're saying, well, if there's 100,000 plus or so consumers there in California, then that's when it would be applicable to you. So they're trying to reduce the burden a little bit by increasing the number of consumers and based on the business that would be applicable to. And then for CCPA, it noted that it derives at least 50% of your annual revenue from selling consumer information, then it would be applicable to you under CCPA. What CPRA is saying, well, it could be that or from sharing that information as well. So from an expansion perspective, this slide was just included to provide some additional information from a CPR perspective, as we noted on the slide before. So if you're selling or sharing personal information of minors, you see that that would also now be included as well. From a research, there's some research exceptions as to, okay, why did we collect the data? What was the purpose of us collecting the data? What did you sign off to, right? You may end up removing or deleting the data, but you may have some legal basis as to how long you should be keeping the data based on what was signed. And as you can see from a research exemption there. And there is an ability to opt into financial incentive under CPRA. This is the area that I thought would be particularly helpful in terms of some of the questions and feedback that we got from you and other clients is, how do we improve our privacy compliance documentation then? So we want to ensure that you are evaluating, planning, and adjusting, and then continuing that audit steps. So you want to perform a data audit and gap assessment to find out what it is that we need to do. Where are we today? So that's where you're evaluating your current state. And some of the questions you want to ask is, okay, who should be protected? How is the regulation enforced, right? Can we be sued if we do this? So getting an understanding of the regulation will help as well in terms of putting your compliance plan together. Then once you understand that, then you go ahead and you design the plan. Use that gap assessment and remediation plan then to design your plan to put in place. Ensure that it's addressing your deficiencies, update your policies, and then implement the plan. You want to do an ongoing change and review, right, to make sure that you're training employees, you're distributing those policies and procedures, and making sure that you're implementing the controls that are in place. Of course, it's an ongoing thing, right? Every 3 to 6 months, you want to check to make sure that you are addressing and following the policies that are noted in your privacy plan, and audit and repeat, right? You start it, you put it in place, you implement it, audit it, and see if it's working. And then this is something that I would encourage you to follow. So in summary, to build a privacy compliance program, then ensure that there's someone who is responsible for the program. Have an inventory of your items, hardware and software, perform a gap assessment, create a compliance roadmap, right? Ensure that you have documented policies and procedures in place and have some training in place as well. So you would want to summarize with, in order to have an ongoing security and data management practice in place, understand the risk that you have in place, ensure that you have a security and privacy as a culture in place, not just when the audit is happening, but ensure that it's a part of your culture. identify the compliance requirements, and then select the independent assessment that you would want to provide. With that said, I want to turn it over to Phil to see if there's any question that came in as we wrap up here in the next couple of seconds.
Yeah, nice job on timing. And one question, just what activities will PIM be doing to drive awareness of SOC HITRUST certifications? I think as Steve mentioned earlier, we're working to kind of partner to put some resources together to have a website where there's a lot of information that will help to kind of answer some questions, provide you with resources, up to, keep it up to date with current trends, things like that, and allow you to, can always connect to Katie and myself. You've got our emails here as well. And feel free to reach out if you have questions as you're implementing or working through those. Steve, anything else?
Well, yeah, I do absolutely have a couple follow-up things. So first of all, Phillip and Kadian, thank you so much. I mean, that was a lot of information to convey. It's an important topic. It's also complicated. And so we understand that all this information being thrown at you is maybe not going to land immediately, but I think it was a good start to this conversation, but we want to keep it up. And as I mentioned, we at PIM are going to be adding in a portal on our website. And I know that PI Bid America already has data management training, and other affiliates are going to be taking advantage of all of these data management resources as well. But I wanted to, there was one question that was posed to the affiliates is what can we as affiliate leaders do to help identify the value of SOC and HITRUST certifications to their customers, to the buyers of print and graphic communications. Have you seen any initiatives in that arena, or do you have any suggestions on how that might get accomplished?
So I think it's it kind of can as you go through the process, share the report, and if you see what the end result is, sharing that with buyers will help to demonstrate the value of the level of maturity around security. I think it depends on the industry that they're in for what they would be aware of. So you're not having to answer a security questionnaire. They'll be aware of what a SOC 2 report involves, what a HITRUST certification involves. So that is really driven a lot by the industry. But from pushing the awareness, I'm not sure if there's anything that we're seeing else, Kadian or maybe Steve, that you guys could touch on.
Let me ask you, because I think that was actually an important point you just made, is that you really tied that conversation back specifically to the print buyer and their particular industry. Mm-hmm. So the needs are then is to share to them in their world why you're specifically understanding their particular needs that are related to their industry. Do you have that kind of data? Do you have data on particular industries and how they are actually needing to manage and secure their data specific to their needs? Is that information that you track?
Yeah, I mean, throughout CLA, we've got industry experts within the team that Katie and I are involved in. I don't know if we track it necessarily in kind of a comprehensive format that kind of spells it all out, but I think that's a great idea for something that we could put together for the portal.
Exactly. So if we can have on the portal like how to speak to the healthcare industry of how you're managing their data that speaks directly to their need. How do you speak to general corporate America on managing their data, from different industry perspectives? I think we will be working on that and trying to help our members communicate more effectively to their clients. So
yeah, absolutely. No, that's a good idea. And with the you driving the conversation, it does help to be aware of what industry you're getting involved with from a data standpoint, because your customer client may not be the expert at it, and they may just be sending you information that does have compliance or some type of requirement from a security standpoint that they're not aware of. Just because they're in the industry doesn't mean they're an expert always.
Yeah. One last question came up is, do you think SOC 2 is required for general mailings in the future?
So for general mailings, it kind of depends on, again, the company providing the data, but I think just having an individual's name and address is considered some type of PII. And so there's risk with you obtaining that information for general mailings. That information is valuable on the dark web to be sold and kind of packaged and mapped out, and they kind of take that information, build out profiles, and then sell full data sets on people. So I think you will, as additional breaches continue to occur over and over again, you probably will see an increased, I guess, awareness of security and what their third parties or printers are doing around security. And the SOC 2 is a great way that addresses it kind of across a lot of industries and can be used to demonstrate that. So I don't know if it'll be a requirement. There isn't for any industry, there isn't a requirement for a SOC 2 or for any type of data. It's not, it's more of a request depending on the customers and the business that you have. Kind of follows the lines of, there's no legal requirement for a financial audit. Well, maybe with SEC and publicly traded, but different story there.
Great. All right. Well, thank you for that. Kadian, any final words from you?
Well, I think what I want to point out is that, there are a lot of frameworks that are out there. And as you can see, there are ones that we can do from an assurance perspective. There are some that you could get from a certification perspective. And then there are some just security gap assessments. So you have to identify what works best for you to fulfill the requirements of your clients, and then to ensure that you are maintaining a robust security posture.
Right. All right. Well, thank you for that. Teresa Campbell, any questions or any comments from you? All righty.
Great food for thought. Thank you. A lot of information to be considered.
Terrific. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. We've gone a little bit past our hour, but so head off to lunch, and thank you so much for your time. We look forward to speaking with you all again in the future. Have a great day.
Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.